All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name, as always, is Devon. I'm the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we'll be talking about response contingent surveys. Now, for those of you that don't really know what that is right offhand, it's kind of a bit of a loaded term. Basically, what we'll be doing today is we'll be talking about the different survey objects that we have in ePrime, so specifically the slide button, the slide choice, and the slide slider, and how to perform conditional actions based on the responses made to them. So for buttons, we're going to have ePrime jump to different parts of the experiment based on what button is selected. For slide choices, we're going to include or implement something called an other button. So if you have a series of options, you want participants to be able to specify their own response to this, we're going to implement something like that. And then we're also going to have response based on a slide slider and where the response lies as far as the range is in the slide slider. So unlike some of the other live streams that we've been doing, where I'll be building a sample or something from our experimental or something from our experimental library, or basically where it's going to end up in a full paradigm. Today we're going to end up with more of a kind of a functional sample. It's going to be more demonstrative today, where we're going to show kind of the different ways to use these things. And I definitely don't recommend using whatever we come up with at the end of the day today for actual psychological research. So to go ahead and get started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start from a blank eStudio template. So go ahead and click blank if you're following along at home, and click OK. It can take just about a second to load here. For those of you who are following along, I am using the new version of ePrime 3.0. So I'm actually going to get rid of this advisor tab here and this output tab. We don't really need these for what we're doing today, but I am going to show how to use the output tab a little later, and it's going to be pretty helpful for some of the things that we're doing today. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up the session proc, and I'm going to build everything on my session proc first, just because I'm going to kind of be doing this one at a time. I'm going to have a couple things on my session proc, and then I'm going to go through each of the different blocks individually, because each block is going to represent a different way of interacting with the survey objects in ePrime. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a text display as the first object in my session proc. I'm just going to rename this from text display 1 to welcome. And I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to double click on that and just write some very simple text in here. Just welcome to the sample. Sample will demonstrate response contingency with the following e-objects. And I'll do slide button, slide choice, slide slider, and press space to begin. So this is just some very simple text that has to do with just basically, telling everybody what the sample is about. There isn't really anything that the participant has to do in this, since this isn't really a paradigm that anyone's going to be doing. Just a very simple set of instructions. And the only thing we have to do here is I'm actually going to take the windows here and I'm going to cascade them quick, just so you can see the words there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change some of the properties of this slide text sub-object, of this text display object. So this text display object is going to have just this text here, but it says press space to begin, so we want to actually implement that. So I'm going to click on the properties page icon, and I'm going to go over here to the duration input tab. Now the duration by default is set to 1000 milliseconds, which should be more than enough time to read this, but I do want to implement that whole press space to begin part of it. So I'm going to change the duration from 1000 milliseconds to infinite and change data logging to time audit only. What this will do is just let me know exactly how long this object was on screen and if there's any delays in getting it on the screen, which honestly is about enough for my welcome screen. I'm going to click add for devices, and I'm going to add a keyboard input mask, which just tells ePrime, hey, the participant's going to be responding with a keyboard at this point. I'm going to change my allowable from any to space. I'm going to hit apply and OK. And that's all we need to do. So now that my welcome screen's made, I need to make a goodbye screen. Now it seems a little weird to put the goodbye screen right next to the welcome screen, but I'll show you why we're going to do that in a second, because it is actually going to show up at the very end of the experiment based on the scope of the experiment, because I'm putting it on the session proc right now. So take a text display and I'm going to add it right next to my welcome, and I'm going to rename this one to goodbye. And goodbye is going to be just a very simple message here, just very much for your participation. Hope this sample was helpful. There we go. And I'm actually going to keep all of the default values for this duration input. I know there are some labs out there that don't like any of the participants to see kind of the internals of ePrime or see eStudio like this. I know that they only like to show the participants just the run screen, and if that's what your lab likes to do, that's completely fine. If that's the case, change the duration to infinite, add a keyboard input mask, and set your allowable to whatever button you want there. But in this case, it's fine if it just flashes on the screen, thanks whoever's running the sample, and then goes away. I'm going to change data logging here to time audit only though. And once I know that that's all applied alright, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So I'm going to exit out of my goodbye. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a list object in between my welcome and goodbye text display objects. This list object is going to represent the entirety of the sample, basically. It's where the rest of the sample is going to be, and it's going to be contained between the welcome and the goodbye object. So that way, even though the welcome and goodbye objects seem like they're next to each other right now, they will absolutely not be displayed in succession. So I'm going to take a list object from my toolbox and put it just between welcome and goodbye. And I'm going to rename my list one to block list and hit enter. So now that I've done that, I'm going to double click on it to open it in eStudio, to open the properties page here, and I'm going to make a couple of different procedures. Now the first procedure that I'm going to make is going to deal strictly with the slide button. I'm going to demonstrate how the slide button can be used to jump to different parts of the experiment based on how the participant responded. So I am going to change this one just to button proc. I'm going to hit enter. It says does not exist, but I'd like to create it. I'm going to click yes. And I would not like to make this procedure the default value for newly created levels, because I'm going to have a bunch of different levels, not just button proc again and again and again. So I'm going to click no in this case. Now for now, this is all we're going to make. We're going to come back to this list a couple times, and we're going to be adding a few more procedures to this. But for now, I think this is exactly what we need. So let's go ahead and X out of this. I'll close out of this one as well. And I will double click on the button proc here to open it. And as you can see, it looks just like my session proc. It's just a different procedure, also has a start and also has an end. But in this case, the end goes to goodbye, instead of exiting out the experiment like my session proc did. So the first thing I'm going to add here is a slide object. And the slide object is going to represent the different options participants have for buttons. So I'm actually just going to rename this one from slide to question. We will change it to question 1. I'm only going to have one question slide on here, but if this is something that you want to implement in a much larger study, if you have a much larger survey and want to make all of these responses contingent, then it's important to label the questions like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to take, in my question 1, is we can take a very simple text display object and put it at the top here. This is going to represent the question that I'm posing to participants. Now, this part of the experiment is going to vary based on what your paradigm is. So what questions you're asking the participant, where do the questions redirect, how do they differ? I'm, in this case, just going to make them as generic as possible, so once you're done making this, you can just change the text on it, change the text on the slide objects or the button objects, anything. Just change the very simple text that we have to kind of fit your experiment. So everything here is going to seem a little generic, but the reason for that is so you can better implement it into your task later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the name or the text on here just from text 1 to please select one of the 2 options below. Now, like I said, very generic. Obviously, in a survey, this will be a much more in-depth question. But the 2 options below are going to be represented by slide buttons. So I'm going to take 2 slide buttons and add them to my slide object. I'm going to do that by clicking on slide button on the left-hand side of the screen here, and just clicking anywhere here. I can move these, resize them however I want. So I'm going to resize this button to look kind of like I want. It's going to be a little bigger. And then instead of making a new one and trying to resize this the way that trying to resize it just to match this button, I'm actually just going to click on this button once, click Control-C on my keyboard, click out of it and click Control-V on my keyboard. And as you can see, another button appeared and kind of layered itself on top there. So if I take that other button and slide it just directly over here, I now have a button the same size and the same shape, and it'll be right along the same y-axis there, which is exactly what I want, because it really bothers me when one of them is just a little higher than the other. And I can also double check this just by going to frame and checking the y value there. And that's at 63, and if I check out this one, also at 63, that's perfect. So now that I have my two buttons, it doesn't make sense for either one of them to just say button and button. So let's speed these up a little bit. Let's go ahead and click on the properties page for button 1. And I knew that it was button 1A because it was highlighted down here, so you can see these little squares. But I could also tell it was highlighted because the name button 1 appeared right here in this little sub-object properties drop-down menu. That's how I knew that I was getting the properties of button 1. So I want to change the name of button 1. I'm just going to call it option A. Now, when I was typing that, if you notice down here under response, it was actually changing. So what it does is it actually says response reported by the slide button shall report as, and then it's matching exactly what my name is in here, and I'm just going to call it option A. So the responses reported by the slide button shall report as option A in the response property. This is really important to keep in mind. And this is going to kind of be one of the major themes that we talk about in relation to any of these objects today when we're talking about response contingency, is we need to know exactly what kind of responses we're getting from these objects. So if we look at this property here, it says responses are going to log as option A in curly brackets. That's going to be important to know because we're going to want to do options based on whether or not this is reported. I'm going to click apply to save that change. I'm going to hop over to theme. Now, first I want to change the text on this object just from button to option A. And I'm going to put a space in there. And again, if you've been following along with these live streams, you know that anytime you change the text of an object, it actually will, or change any of these properties from their default value, they'll actually show up bold. That's why it shows up bold here and doesn't show up bold here. Or also why it shows up bold here, but the bold property is currently set to no. And what I'm also going to do is right now, I'm going to change the background. So the background is actually looking in this resources folder. And right now it's looking for enhanced 1 gray light and at state, which just means that it's looking for a normal type background here. So if I click on this button here, it's actually going to take me to it'll take me to my resources folder. So, or it'll just open this up and I go to my resources folder. So if I go to my resources folder here for e'Prime3, and we'll look at backgrounds here, and simple. So these are all the simple backgrounds that we have for a button object. These could be changed, these can be added, you can put whatever you wanted here, and those are our simple ones. And then these are our more enhanced ones. And I kind of like the enhanced ones a little more. They look a little bit more, they look a little bit nicer, a little flashier. And as you can see, each one of them has a couple of different states. So this one, for example, Violet, has a down state, a fixed state, a hover state, and a normal state. Normal is just when it's sitting on the side like this. Hover is whenever you hover your mouse over it. Fixated is whenever you fixate your mouse over it for a long time. And then down is what it looks like whenever you click on it. I'm just going to make these options pretty simple. I'm going to make them red and blue. So I'm going to change that just to make it red. I'm going to click apply and OK. As you can see, that now changes to red. And I'm going to make the same one to my other option, but I'm going to make this one blue. So I'm going to click on this button here. I'm going to change the name to option B. And as you can see, my resp property is going to change to option B in curly brackets, which is exactly what I want. Click apply to save that change and hop over to my theme tab. So text, similarly, is just going to change to option B. There we go. And click apply to watch that change happen. And I'm going to go to background, and I'm going to change my background for this one as well. As you can see, e'Prime remembered that this is the folder I was looking at, so it took me right here. So I'm going to double click on this blue and click apply and OK. So now I have a red option and a blue option, option A and option B. So that's perfect. Right now I have two slides that look really good, and they look like two slide buttons that look really good, and they look like how I want them to be. But they don't actually do anything contingent yet. There's nothing response-based about them. To do that, I'm actually going to go into my properties for the entire slide object itself, not for the slide, not for the property, or not for the sub-objects here. So I'm going to click on the properties page for the whole slide object, and then click on the duration input tab. Now the first change I'm going to make is I'm actually going to set the duration from 1000 milliseconds to infinite. I'm going to do this because I want participants to have as much time as they need to select one of the two options. I'm going to change my data logging in this case to standard because I do want to I do want to know what they've responded to. Now I'm going to do this part. The way that I'm going to do this is going to be a little different than the way that I do anything else. But this is a way to get response contingency if you only have two options like this and don't want to use script. It's one of the little tricks that we have. If I go ahead and click add, I'm going to add a button object because obviously participants are responding to the button object. Now if I keep this at its default of just this wildcard character, any button click, regardless of which one I click on, is going to end up terminating the exact same way, and we'll move on because of this end action to the next object in the experimental procedure. But in this case, I want to change this to option A. I'm going to click apply. So now this input mask, or this button input mask, is only tied to my option A. And right now, option B isn't being processed at all. I mean, if I run the experiment now and click on option B, nothing is going to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another button object. I'm going to change the allowable to this one to button or option B. And instead of my end action being set to terminate here, I'm going to set my end action to jump. And I need to fill in a jump label. Now, I don't have a jump label just yet, but I'm going to say one here. Let's call it option B label, and I'm going to click apply. Now, one of the things that does kind of confuse users at first when they do something like this is if you notice this jump label is never goes away. The jump label is entirely unrelated to these input masks. You can only associate one jump label with one slide object. You can't like make them contingent on, like, so I can't have this input mask have a different jump label than this input mask. They all have to be the exact same jump label. And that's very important to keep in mind whenever you're programming something like this. But if you look here, whenever I click here, the things that are changing are my allowable that I typed in and the end action. So button or option A, whenever I click on it, is literally just going to move on to the next item in my procedural timeline, while option B is going to jump to somewhere else. So let's go ahead and set that up. So this one's called option B label, so I need to go ahead and make that one. So this is going to be called option B label. Now, what I added here was called a label object. Now, these don't have any inherent properties. I'm going to double click on it to open it up here to open up its properties. All you see is just the name, a tag, which is just something that I can put if I want to have it referenced differently in my data file, and any notes that I might have on it. The notes have no bearing on runtime, and they don't really have any bearing on the data file either. They're just design notes, basically. So if I want, I could put something like, the experiment will jump here if the participant presses blue option B button on question 1 object. Put slide object. Now, again, this note that I wrote has absolutely no bearing on anything, and it's not going to affect my experiment at all. But if I happen to pass this off to somebody else, or somebody else wants to take a look at this sample, this note's going to be really helpful for them to understand the function of this option object, or this option B label object. So it is important, just not necessarily for running the experiment. So right now I have my option B label right after my question 1, which means if E prime terminates, or if they press on the red button and it terminates, it's going to move on to my option B label, and if they click on B, it's going to terminate and move on to my option B label. And those aren't different actions, those are the same actions. So even though you're jumping, it's going to the next object, and that's not inherently different. So let's go ahead and change that up. So I'm going to add another slide object here, and I'm going to change this one to question 1A. Because this is where I want E prime to go if participants choose option A. I want participants to go to option 1A. But if participants press option B, I don't want them to see 1A at all. I want them to go to option B. So I'm going to have a slide object just after my option label, or option B label, and I'm going to rename this one to question 1B, which is where participants are going to go once they've clicked on question B, and they'll completely skip over question 1A. So now that I have all this, I need to do one more thing. I need to add one more label, because how the experiment's set up right now is if participants press on option A, it's going to terminate and it's going to go to question 1A. But then, because of how E prime interacts with everything, it's also going to go to B label and then go to question B and then terminate the procedure. But I only want A to see A. So I'm going to have to add one more label object over here, and it's going to be just after my question 1b. I'm just going to call it after option B. There we go. And that's just going to make everything much nicer once I start diving into question 1a and question 1b. Let's go ahead and change the properties of question 1a, and once we do all this, we'll kind of run it just to show you guys how it works. So I'm going to make a simple text display object here, and this is just going to say you have selected option A. Press the button below to continue. And I'll just add a button here. And since option A was red, I'm also going to make this button red, just for consistency's sake. So for that, I'm going to click on the properties page here. I'm going to hop over to this theme tab again, go back to background, and I'm going to change this to my normal red. And there we go. And I'm going to make this just a little bigger, and I'm actually going to change the text on this too, so instead of saying button, it's just going to say continue. There we go. Now I need to change one more thing, and it's going to be very similar to what I changed on my question 1 object. I'm going to click on the properties page for the entire object here, and I'm going to go on the duration input tab. I'm going to change the duration back to infinite so participants have as much time to process this as they need. I'm going to change my data logging to standard. I'm going to add a button input mask, and in this case I'm going to keep the allowable at the wildcard. Now I'm doing that specifically because I don't really want e'prime to try to differentiate between any of the buttons I have on here, because I only have one button. So there's really no sense in trying to specify button 1 here, because if I do that, it's going to functionally be identical to e'prime's default, so it doesn't make any sense not to keep it. So I'm just going to keep it at that wildcard character. But in this case, instead of terminate, I would like e'prime to jump, and I'm going to jump to after option B. So now when this runs, if participants choose the option A track, they're only going to see things related to option A, and if they choose the option B track, they're only going to see things related to option B. So I'm going to make option B very similar to my option A here. I'm going to actually double click on my question 1 here, or my question 1A, and I'm going to highlight both of the things on this slide. And I do that just by selecting one of the objects, holding down Control, and selecting the other object. Then I hit Control C. I'm going to hop over to my my question 1B slide object and click Control V to paste. And as you can see, it actually pastes a duplicate of these things. So now I only have to tweak a few of the properties instead of making all of these things over again. So I'll say you've selected option B, press the button below to continue. And I'm going to change some of its properties, and honestly I just need to change the theme in the theme tab. I'm going to click on background, and I'm going to change the theme just to that dark blue theme to maintain consistency between A and B. So now that I have those changes, that's really all I need. I want to go into my properties page here and change the duration input tab again. I want to make sure that the duration is set to infinite. I want to make sure the data logging is set to standard. I want to make sure that the button object is my device, and I want to keep this all normal. And in this case, I'm not going to jump anywhere. I'm actually just going to terminate here. So I'm going to click apply and OK. I'm going to go ahead and save this so I can run it. So I'm going to save this just on my desktop, and I'll just call it survey sample. There we go. Good morning, everyone. I see a few more people joining. Thank you guys for messaging everybody in the chat. If you guys have any questions, by the way, please feel free to send me a message in the chat. I'd be happy to expand on anything or make anything, a little more interactive, or if there's something you'd like to see me repeat, or even if there's something slightly related that you'd like to see, please feel free to give me a shout out. Alright, so now that I have this all set up, I'm going to go ahead and run this in window mode here just to show you guys what this is going to look like. So here's my welcome screen here. Right now I have the slide button part of it done. We'll get to choice and slider next. So please select one of the two options below, option A and option B. I will select option A. It says you selected option A, press the button below to continue. You can see I have that red continue button now because we've selected the option A track, and now if it continues correctly, we shouldn't see anything of option B. And there's my end slide. So now participants have seen all of option A, and they haven't seen anything of option B. So let's give that one more run, but this time we'll select option B just to show you what that's going to look like once they go down that track. I don't need to save data for this. Alright, please select one of the two options below. I'm going to select option B in this case. So it says you've selected option B, press the button below to continue. And perfect, so now participants are successfully going down the option B track without seeing anything of option A either. So that's just one easy way to make kind of response contingent buttons. This is just using the jump label and doesn't actually involve inline script. Next, we're actually going to move on to the slide choice, and when we do the slide choice, we're not actually we're going to have to use inline script in this one. The script is going to be very easy, I promise, but it does involve a little bit of scripting, and I'll walk you guys through that. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to click on my block list here. I'm going to add another level to this. This procedure here was called button proc, so this one is going to be called choice proc. I'm going to hit enter. It says choice proc does not exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. And it doesn't ask me about default value for newly created levels because of course I don't need that right now. I'm going to exit out of all of those, and I'm going to double click on my choice proc here. Now, as far as choice proc is concerned, one of the questions that we get most often about slide choices in ePrime is what happens if I want participants to respond other. So, I have a couple of options, but I want them to input their own option whenever they see an other question. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a slide object and I'm going to put it at the beginning of my choice proc. Now, this choice proc here, I'm actually going to rename. I'm going to rename this one just to choice question. I know, not very creative, just the word question with choice in front of it. I'm going to double click on it to open it in eStudio. Now, instead of adding all of the components of a slide choice item, I'm actually going to go into my slide layout templates, which is something that I personally believe is criminally underused in eStudio. I think that everybody should be using this because it's really, really easy to use. So just click on this drop down here, and you can see that there's a lot of options for pre-set up, or pre-programmed, if you will, slide objects. And what I'm going to do in this case is this 5-item single selection, and look what it does for me. I'm going to click on it, and it'll say, are you sure you want to insert the slide layout template? I will click yes, and ePrime will automatically load all of the e-objects onto my slide and space them out in such a great way, because honestly, spacing is one of my bigger concerns whenever I'm making a slide object. But if I click on the properties page icon in the top left-hand corner here, you can see that it also changes all of my duration input properties. It changes it to duration. You don't have to listen to me drone on about adding a button input mask and changing the allowable to next instead of the data logging, even though I just did. And it also changes this input source, which is probably one of the more important things that it changes. It changes the input source from input mask to choice 1. Now the reason it does that is because if you look at my input mask, it's set to the next button and actually doesn't mention this slide choice object at all. And that's really important because if I have my ACC, RT, and response set to input mask, which is what its default value is, it's going to tell you when participants clicked on that next button and that they clicked on the next button. But it's going to completely ignore the fact that there's this big old slide choice here that happens to be the main part of this slide object. So if we change this input source to choice 1, whenever I print out my data file, my choice question accuracy, response, and response time are actually going to be in relation to the slide choice object, which is going to be more of what we want for our data than whether or not they hit the next button and how long it took them to hit the next button. So I'm going to keep all these changes because I definitely don't need to edit them at all. In this case, I'm going to get rid of the survey header and the question instruction. I don't necessarily need that. It's going to be a much more simple survey than that, and I'm just going to click delete. Now, I'm going to come up with a relatively nonsense question here just to demonstrate how these features work in ePrime. You may use this in your survey if you want. It's not going to be particularly, well, depending on your study, it might be helpful. I'm just going to change my question prompt in this case to please select your favorite food from the list below. Alright, and then there's my list. So I have 5 items here, single selection, so participants can't select multiple favorite foods, they can only have one. It's very hard for me to do personally, but I think that we can make them make that choice. Let's go ahead and click on the choice 1 object here, and we have to edit the properties, because if you see right now, item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and item 5 aren't very descriptive. and I know my favorite food is an item 1. So I'm going to click on sub-object properties here. Now, if you're familiar with how the list object works, this table down here is going to look very familiar. This is just ways to fill in different properties of each item on the choice object. You can see that there's 5 items going down this way, and my labels are here. So if I change one of the labels, so if instead of item 1 I type the word pizza, which may happen to be my favorite food, and click OK, you can see that item 1 gets updated from item 1 to pizza, which sounds much more appetizing than item 1 does. So we'll add a few more food items. So tacos, ice cream, hummus, and we'll keep our item 5 as other. Click apply and OK. And if it doesn't look like it updated immediately, it doesn't mean anything happened in eStudio. Just go ahead and click in that slide object, and you can see everything changing there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change how the response is output to this object. Now right now I need to take a look at this resp source property, and right now it just says value. So right now if I respond to any one of these things, e' is going to output its value as the response. And the value here is 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Now that's good if I know exactly how those things are mapped, and I don't mind having 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 as my response to this object. But I want this to be a little bit more verbose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my response source from value to label. So now the response that's going to be made to the slide object is going to be pizza, tacos, ice cream, hummus, or other. It's not going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'm stuck later trying to figure out what did 5 mean. So I'm going to click apply and OK to save those changes. Now, I want to make sure that it's outputting exactly what I want, and I want to double check how it's outputting things. There's a very easy way to do that in e' that doesn't necessarily involve you having to write a data file and then search through the data file. And that's just a statement in inline script called the debug print statement. What the debug.print statement does is it allows you to print objects to e''s debug tab, so right here in the output window, I don't need that advisor tab, right here to this output window, and it allows you to basically write whatever you want here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my choice proc and I'm going to add another inline object, or add an inline object, and I'm just going to call this one something nice and generic, just process response. I do like the names of inline objects to reflect their function, kind of like the E objects, so that's why I changed that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a debug.print statement to see exactly what my choice question is outputting. So to do a debug.print statement, you type debug.print. Now what this is going to do is it says everything after this I'm going to print to the output window that I have at the bottom of the screen here. Right now it's obviously not going to print anything, but I want it to print choice question.resp. So what this is going to do is it's going to tell me exactly how my choices are being output to the window here. And I'm going to hop into my block list here because I want to change the weight of this from 1 to 5. And I'm going to do that so I can actually cycle through all of my options. So I can click on pizza, tacos, ice cream, hummus, and other. And then e' is going to spit out every single one of those so I know exactly what I'm dealing with as far as the responses are concerned. So I'm actually going to go through here and I'm going to change my weight to 0 as well for the button proc because I don't really want the button proc to run right now. I'm more focused on the choice proc. I could also do this by clicking on this and then making this list object interactive and not selecting the choice proc or the button proc. But in this case, I'm actually just going to run this or run it in this way. So I'm going to click on test and then I'll show you guys how this works. So as you see here, I get my my startup screen, and e' skipped the button proc and is now in the choice proc. So I'm going to click on pizza and click next. So as you can see here, my output window, or my output part of this experiment window back here, is showing me exactly what my output tab is going to print out. So whenever I go back into eStudio at the end of the run, I output and it's going to say pizza. This is just what my debug.print statement is printing out. So there's pizza. I'm going to click on tacos. It's going to say tacos down here. I'll click on hummus, and there's hummus. I'll click on ice cream, and it shows up as ice cream, and other shows up as other. Now that's perfect because this means that my output is looking exactly how I expect it to look. So now I can write script around this output because I know that e' is using this as the .resp property for my choice question. So I'm going to change this weight back to 1. And I'm going to change this process responses because I want another window to appear if participants select other. So I'm going to make something called an if-then statement in ePrime, and this is probably one of the more basic kinds of scripting things that you can do. And what this is saying is this is a way to kind of program contingency into your experiment. In this case, I want to say if participants select other, take them to a screen so they can enter something else. So to do that, I'm going to say if choice question .rest. Now keep in mind I was accessing the .rest property up here, and in my debug tab I know exactly how my .rest property is going to turn out. So I want to say if it equals other. So if the .rest equals, and I'm putting this in quotes because ePrime saves anything as the .rest property. It's called a string variable, which just means that it's a series of words. It could be words and letters as well, but you can't do math on these, obviously, so it's considered a string type variable in ePrime. And any string type variable in ePrime needs to be referenced in quotation marks like this. So that's one of the reasons that I have the word other in quotes and not just down here as the word other like it appears there. So I'm going to say if choice question.resp equals other, then now instead of doing jump labels like that, I'm actually going to do something completely different. And I'm going to kind of stop my scripting right here because I need to program one other thing very quickly in order for this to work. So I'm going to go into my choice prop one more time, and I'm going to take a slide here. And I am going to rename this slide, and this is just going to be called follow slide. Again, name kind of follows the function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a slide object, or a slide text sub-object here. And the slide text sub-object is literally just going to be for people that didn't select other. So this is just going to be for people that say, clicked pizza, for example. I'll just say you selected, and then I'm going to make an attribute reference here to an attribute that doesn't exist. I'm kind of working a little bit backwards here, but you'll see how it all kind of comes together later. You selected. Continue button to continue. There we go. Not very clever text, but effective text. So I'm going to go ahead and add another button here. This is going to be the continue button that I had mentioned, and it's just going to be a very simple button. So all I do is go into the properties here, go into the theme, change the text to continue, and then just click apply and OK. And then I'm going to change the property here. Change that to infinite, add a button object, and that's going to be exactly what I want. Perfect. Now what I have to do here is I said you've selected favorite food because I want participants to actually see what their favorite food was on here. So I'm going to go back to my process responses slide. I'm going to add one other line of script here, and it's just going to be something called a setAttrib command. So let's use c.setAttrib. And my attribute that I'm going to call is just going to be called favorite food. And then it's going to be set to choice question.resp. So what's going to happen now is if participants respond to anything, so if they click on pizza, it's going to make a new attribute called favorite food, and it's going to set that response to pizza, or going to set that property to pizza. And then once it gets to this slide object, it's going to say you selected pizza, in exclamation point, click continue button to continue. And that's exactly what we want for this part of it. Now, I want to change what happens when they press other, because other isn't a favorite food, and that doesn't really make any sense. So what I want to do is I want to add another slide state to this slide object. Now what's going to happen here is if I click on add slide state, I now have two slide states I can choose from, state 1 and state 2. I would like state 1 to appear only when participants have selected an actual food item, so pizza, tacos, hummus, ice cream. I want state 2 to appear whenever participants click other. So I'm actually going to add a text display object here. And I'm going to add this text display object and kind of stretch it a little big. And I'm going to say, you've selected other. Please type favorite food below. continue button when you are finished. Now this is going to be a little bit multifaceted. Most of it's going to be pretty easy. What I'm going to do is add a continue button, and I'm going to do that just by adding this button. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over to state 1 and copy this button just so it's identical. And all I did was click here, click on my continue button, click Control C, hop over to state 2, and click Control V to paste it. So there's my continue button down there. Now what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to add something called a display echo. Now I don't know if we've talked about this really in any of our other live streams, but what it does is it takes what you're typing and it actively shows it on the screen as you're typing it, and it's pretty useful for something like this. Now to add a display echo, what you have to do is you have to click on the properties page icon here and then click on the duration input tab. You have to add a keyboard input mask and then click on this advanced tab. Now since I want participants to be typing entire words, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change my max count to something a little larger than 1. I'll change it to 100. Most food names aren't over 100 characters long, so 100 should be completely fine there. And I'm going to go over here to my echo device. I'm going to add an echo device, and the only echo device option that I have is display. And what this is saying is that I want to take any response made to this keyboard button or this keyboard object, and I want to show it on the display here. Now if I double click on it, there are a few properties that I need to change. The first one are this X and Y property. Now the X and Y properties are a little trickier than some of the other X and Y properties that we deal with in other sub-objects. The X and Y property in the other sub-objects deals with the very center of that sub-object and where you want to place the center of that sub-object. The X and Y property in this case actually deals with the top left corner of the display object, or of the display echo. So if I do 50-50, like I normally would with most display objects to show it right in the middle of the screen, instead of showing up in the middle of the screen, it's actually going to show up kind of on like this portion of the screen right here. It'll look like it's in the bottom right hand corner because the Y value of 50% is making sure the top left hand corner, so right here if we're talking about this window, shows up in the 50% part of the screen. So we're going to want to change this just a little bit. So I'm actually going to change my X value from 50% to 30%. And I'm going to change my Y value to 30% as well. And this should end up a little better for us. Height's 25, width is 75. Now the important thing to keep in mind too are this forecolor and backcolor property. By default, the forecolor is white and the backcolor is black, which means you're going to have a black field on which you enter white text, which, I mean, does a really good job of differentiating itself from the rest of the slide object, but I want it to all kind of remain uniform in this case. So I'm going to change my forecolor here to black, and I'm going to change my backcolor to white, and I'm going to add a 2 pixel width border around the whole thing. So it's going to look like a nice little box that we can respond to. So now that we have that, if you go ahead and look at the slide object, now that we've actually made our display echo, you don't see it on the slide at all during design time, and that's one of the little quirks of using an echo object. It only appears on screen once you've done, or once you're done, once you run the experiment. It doesn't actually show up during design time. So while it looks like there's nothing to show here, if I go into my duration input tab here and click on the advanced properties of the keyboard object, you see it's actually displaying to the screen, which is exactly what we want. And if you look, it's not actually echo here or the display echo here. It doesn't actually apply to the button object. It only applies to our keyboard object, which is another very important aspect of this. Now the last thing I want to change in order to make this work is this process responses part here. Now right now I have most of this if-then statement done, but I don't have all of it done, and this is why I wanted to kind of program the slide object and then kind of back up into this. So I just have if slide choice question or slide question dot response equals other, then now I'm just going to change the slide state that appears. So if it's other, then I want follow-up slide dot active state, which just says the state that appears, the slide state that appears whenever you run the program or whenever you run the experiment. So in this case, in follow-up slides case, one of these two, I want it to equal state 2 if they've selected other. Equals, and I'll call this one state 2. And I'll just type else, and I'll do follow-up slide.activeState equals state 1. So what's going to happen now is whenever participants select other, it's going to show them this follow-up slide on which they can actually type and write their other favorite food. Or if they don't select, the other or or if they don't select other and they select one of the, actual food items, it's going to show them state 1, which looks like this, and I'll let them click the continue button to continue. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to demonstrate it by going into my block list here and making sure that only my choice proc is selected, which it is. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and click space to begin. So let's go ahead and select an actual food item. So I'm going to select pizza first and click next. So it said you've selected pizza, and it says continue. So that's perfect. So I'm going to exit out of that. Now what you noticed right there was you actually noticed that the display echo showed up on top of, right here, this press continue button to continue. Now the reason I did that is because if you notice, the display echo isn't actually set to any particular slide state. And that's kind of one of the major points I wanted to bring up today about the display echo. It doesn't actually know what slide state you're currently working with. So it applies to all states on all slides. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to change the echo object just a little bit to kind of cheat what I'm doing here. And I'm going to change the border back to 0 point because you saw that little black square there. I'm going to make my Y down a little more there just so I can actually see all of the text. And I'm going to make it so it isn't even an option or doesn't appear to be an option when you select your favorite food. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change the weight of this block just so I can run it a couple times to demonstrate a couple of the different options that we have here, instead of having to go back into eStudio. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0. There's our welcome screen. Alright, select your favorite food, pizza, next. You've selected pizza, press continue to continue. You're not even aware that there is an echo object secretly right there. So go ahead and click other. You've selected other, please type your favorite food below. I'm going to say in this case my favorite food is salad. And once I start typing it, it now appears below. So now I'll say my favorite food is tuna. And you see tuna there. So now this is just displaying, and I have 100 characters to kind of write what I want, mess up, click backspace, anything like that. So I'll put kale as my favorite food and click continue. And now if I check ice cream, it'll say you've selected ice cream, hummus, you've selected hummus, go back to pizza, and there we go. So that's how that would work in ePrime. That's how you would make kind of like an other button in ePrime. And especially if you want that other button to only show up once they've clicked other, and you want something else entirely to show up if they haven't clicked it. And it's a way to kind of hide the display echo too if you want to do that, because they do apply to the entire slide object and not just a particular slide state. So the last thing we're going to do today is we're going to do something contingent with a slide choice item. So a slide slider item. The slide slider is going to be a little different. Now what we're going to do is, instead of saying if you've selected a specific variable, we're going to do if you've selected a range. So I'm going to add one more level to this list object, and this is going to be called slider proc. I'm going to hit enter here. It says it does not exist, but I'd like to create it, and I absolutely would, and I'm going to change this to 0, so I'm only running my slider proc. I'm going to double click on it to open it in my workspace here, and I'm going to close all these windows at the top. I don't need any of those there. So just click close all, and go ahead and open up my slider proc again. Now I'm going to add a slide object, and I'm going to rename this one just to slider question. I'm going to double click on it to open it in my workspace. Now I'm going to add another slide layout template, mostly for time saving measures, but also because I really like the way that they're laid out. And this one is just going to be called 10-point show value all labels and text-based prompt. So go ahead and click yes. It takes a little bit of a second to draw and make sure it updates all the properties correctly. I'm going to click OK. Now, similar to my survey, my slide choice object, I don't need the survey header or the question instruction. I just want to delete those. in my question prompt here, I'm going to change to just, I'll do something very simple for this one. Please pick a number between 1 and 10. So now, without having to really do anything but change the text, I'm going to go ahead and run this to show you guys what it looks like here. Without having to change anything aside from that text that I had first changed, I have a fully functioning slide slider that allows me to pick any number that I want, and the little item at the top updates every time I change something about the slider, and I click next to continue. Now again, I had mentioned that the response is the most important part of this, so if I click on this properties page here, you can see that for my slider question, the accuracy and all of the, accuracy, RT, and response actually default to input mask, so those are going to tell me all about the next button. I want to change this to slider 1. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to make a little inline object just after slider 1, or just after a slider question. And all this is going to be is just, I'm going to do a comparison on the actual response to slider 1, or to that slider that I have. So I'm just going to do if slider question is greater than 5, then I'm going to do just a simple debug.print statement. This is greater than 5. And then else debug.print, this is 5 or fewer. So this is just probably the most simple type of contingency that I can be doing. It is just a very simple IfThen statement with some debug statements. And I am going to rename this inline object just to process slider. Close out of that, and I'm going to go ahead and run this in window mode. We're going to go ahead and take a look at that debug output, or debug print output. There we go. So one of the things that I got, and one of the most important things to keep in mind here, is it said that there was a that there's an operator type mismatch. And the reason there's an operator type mismatch is if you take a look here, I actually have if slider question is greater than 5. I didn't actually specify a property of this. So it's always important to keep in mind that whenever you're typing these things, it's important that you're actually honing in on the specific property, the specific value that you want. So if I want, for example, the RT or the reaction time, I would just do RT. Just referencing the slide object in and of itself isn't enough. You have to actually specify a property. And honestly, it's an easy mistake to make, and you'd be surprised at how often we do see this come up in support. So it is important to keep in mind that whenever you do something like this, you have to keep in mind that you need to specify the property that you're looking at. Go ahead and run this one more time. There's our instructions. Pick a number between 1 and 10. I will select 3 and click next. So my output says this is 5 or fewer, and they are not wrong. That was 5 or fewer. I'm going to run it one more time to see what happens if I select something larger than 5, just to make sure that that other else part of the else if statement is working correctly. I'll select 8. This is greater than 5. Perfect. So now that I know that my responses are working correctly, and I know that this process slider inline object is functioning exactly how I want it to, so I want to then actually use this as part of my experiment. So right now my experiment is just outputting the debug.print statement, and it's not actually doing anything contingently on screen for participants. So I'm going to want to change this to something a little better, and it's going to kind of follow the same procedure as our choice proc did. I'm going to go into my slide proc here, or slider proc. I'm going to take a slide object and put it just after process slider, and I'm going to rename this one just to feedback. And very similarly to my follow-up slide, I'm just going to manipulate the slide state. So I'm actually going to click on new state. So now I have state 1 and state 2. And to make things a little easier on myself, I want to rename these slide states, because right now state 1 and state 2 are fine. They don't really tell me what the point of these states are. So I'm going to call state 1 above 5 and I will call state 2 below 5. That way I know if participants responded above 5 or below 5, and it's a little easier for me to script a little later. So on above 5, I'm going to make a text display object, and this is just going to be very simple. You've selected a number greater than 5. There we go. Press the continue button to end the experiment. I'll say end the sample. I wouldn't consider this an experiment. There we go. And I will shrink that just a little bit so it appears at the top, and I will add a continue button. And I'm going to just change the properties of this button, so click on that text and I will just call it continue. And you know what, I'm going to make this one a little funky, so I'm going to change the background here. What is the funkiest color we have here? You know what, enhanced violet looks good. We'll change it to enhanced violet. And it has a nice little lighting effect on it. Perfect. So now I just want to change, or I just want to make my below 5 very similar to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both of these, click Control C, and Control V to paste them. Looks like, there we go. Added my button object, added my text display object. So I just want to change this one to you've selected a number smaller than or equal to. Just so I'm not correct, or not incorrect here. Selected a number smaller than or equal to 5, and press the continue button to end the sample, and I'm just going to make this button equally funky. Alright, so sometimes in ePrime, if you change some of the properties pretty quickly, ePrime looks like it's attempting to save like this. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and just close out of this window right now. And once I close out of the window, I should be able to hop back right into where I was here. Close out of that. Alright, so while it's doing that, basically all this would have done, had I done this, is it would have done something very similar to my slide choice object. It would have actually just changed between my above 5 and my below 5 slide state, and it would have just made sure that it functioned exactly like my slide choice object had been. But we are running out of time for today, so I am going to go ahead and end the webinar for now, or end the, just go ahead and end the live stream. As always, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any ideas for any future webinars or future live streams that you'd like to see, if you have a particular type of study that you'd like to see, let's say that you have something due probably next semester and you're like, oh man, I would really like to see how this paradigm turns out in ePrime or how this paradigm turns out in ePrime. I'm always happy to cater to anything like that, so please feel free to leave us a comment. And as always, have a great day and I hope you enjoyed the webinar.